Emily Sands walked into Devil's Den Park with a backpack, a camera, and a planned 3 days alone in the wilderness she loved. 2 years later, Brian Talbot vanished on the same trail, leaving behind only a torn scrap of his jacket and a hand-carved totem buried in the dirt. What began as isolated tragedy soon unraveled into something far more sinister, a calculated series of disappearances hidden in plain sight. As authorities raced to uncover the truth, a shocking clue surfaced, pointing to a man long thought dead and a secret buried deep in the forest. This is the terrifying true crime story behind the hiker killer of Devil's Den. In the summer of 2018, Devil's Den Park was alive with color and sound. The dense trees stood tall, their leaves swaying in the warm wind, and the trails buzzed with hikers eager to take in the wild beauty of Arkansas. It was the kind of place where people went to disconnect, where phones had no signal and silence stretched for miles. Emily Sands, a 24-year-old nature enthusiast from Little Rock, arrived at the park with a plan. She was fit, experienced, and prepared for a 3-day solo hike along a popular but rugged trail that looped through the northern cliffs and forests. She checked in with the park rangers, smiled for a selfie at the trailhead, and disappeared into the wilderness. When Emily didn't return 3 days later, her family raised the alarm. Park rangers retraced her intended path. Her campsite was found on the second day's trail near a steep overlook. Her tent was pitched neatly, food untouched, and her hiking gear placed with care. Her phone and journal were missing, but her ID and wallet were still tucked inside her pack. It was as if she had stepped out for a moment and never returned. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no footprints leading away from the camp. Dogs brought in 4-scent tracking lost her trail within 50 feet. Drones scanned the thick canopy from above. Volunteers combed the surrounding area. Nothing. Days stretched into weeks. Rumors started spreading. Some said she had fallen and her body was lost in the undergrowth. Others whispered about human trafficking or a wild animal attack, but nothing explained the eerie neatness of her campsite or why none of her survival gear had been used. The media took interest, broadcasting Emily's face on national news. Interviews with her family painted her as a smart, cautious woman who loved nature but would never go off trail. Despite the attention, no meaningful clues were uncovered. The search was eventually scaled down. Locals grew uneasy. Devil's Den had always had its legend stories of shadowy figures seen deep in the woods, of voices echoing where no one should be. These tales had never been taken seriously. Now, with a real woman missing and no answers, they didn't seem so far-fetched. Campers reported hearing strange noises at night. Some claimed to have seen someone watching them from the tree line. The atmosphere of the park changed. Hikers stopped going alone. Rangers started patrolling in pairs. Emily's case slowly faded from headlines. Her family continued searching on their own, passing out flyers and posting online. But most people moved on. Devil's Den remained open. The trails still walked, the cliffs still admired. But a quiet fear took hold in the background. Something wasn't right in those woods. Something had started that summer in 2018, and the first person to sense it had already vanished. 2 years passed with no trace of Emily Sands. Her case remained open, but cold. Tucked away in the files of the local sheriff's department, Devil's Den Park went on as usual. Tourists returned, drawn by its rugged beauty and endless trails. The warnings were still posted at the ranger station: hike in pairs. Stick to marked paths, report anything unusual, but they blended in like the rest of the park rules. Then, in the fall of 2020, the pattern began again. Brian Talbot was a 38-year-old schoolteacher from Missouri who loved solo hiking trips. He was methodical, careful, and always documented his travels. On October 3rd, he texted his brother a photo of a waterfall deep within the park. That image, time-stamped at 2:17 p.m., was the last anyone ever saw of him. When he didn't show up to work on Monday, the search began. The rangers found his car in the same remote lot Emily had used 2 years earlier. The trail log showed he had signed in. The team followed his planned route. His tent was discovered on the edge of the forested ridge, about 3 miles from Emily's last known campsite. The scene was unsettling. The tent had collapsed inward, as if someone had fallen onto it, but there were no drag marks, no signs of a scuffle. Not far from the site, propped up against a tree, was an object that puzzled investigators: a small wooden figure, crudely carved, with dark stones for eyes and sticks for arms. It was wrapped in twine and half buried in the soil, as if placed deliberately. Underneath it, a shred of fabric from Brian's jacket was stuck to a branch. Nothing else was found. No blood, no tracks, no body. The story caught national attention again, especially as online sleuths began connecting Brian's case to Emily Sands. Articles were written, podcasts launched. People began digging into Devil's Den's history, looking for other vanishings. A few suspicious disappearances emerged from decades earlier, but nothing concrete. Still, a sense of dread grew. Something was stalking that part of the park. Over the next 18 months, 3 more hikers went missing. All were experienced, all hiking alone, and all vanished within a tight radius around the northern ridge. Each time, rangers found eerie clues. A shattered compass. A dead bird arranged in a perfect circle. A torn photo pinned to a tree with a rusted nail. None of these made any logical sense, but the message was clear. These weren't random accidents. Despite their efforts, authorities were no closer to identifying a suspect. There were no witnesses, no security cameras, no clear motive. But the pattern couldn't be ignored. Devil's Den wasn't just dangerous, it was being hunted. And whoever was behind it was careful, patient, and completely invisible. Investigators began to suspect they were dealing with someone who knew the terrain better than anyone. Someone who had lived in those woods. Someone who was watching and waiting. By the beginning of 2023, Devil's Den Park had become a place of whispered warnings and silent stares. The disappearances were no longer dismissed as coincidence. Something was happening deep in the forest, something calculated. With local authorities overwhelmed and public pressure mounting, a private volunteer group called Find the Lost stepped in. Made up of former law enforcement, military veterans, and skilled trackers, their mission was simple: to uncover what officials had missed, and within weeks they found something that would change everything. On a misty morning in late February, during a grid search of the northern ridge, one of the volunteers noticed something unusual: a patch of disturbed earth partly hidden beneath a thicket of low brush and moss-covered rocks. Beneath the ground was a narrow opening to a shallow cave, barely large enough for a person to crawl into. Inside, they discovered what the FBI would later call the cache. The interior of the cave was cold and musty, but signs of activity were obvious. Thin sleeping mat lay flattened against the stone floor. There were rusty tins of food, empty water bottles, and old lanterns. But the most chilling items were the ones carefully stored in a weathered wooden box near the back wall. Inside were printed images of the missing hikers, all cut from news articles or printed from websites. Each picture had been defaced in some way. Emily's face had been scribbled out with ink. Brian's eyes had been burned through. In one photo, the background had been circled, as if the person behind it had been studying not just the victims, but their surroundings. There were also several maps of the park, each marked with thick red lines. Trails were crossed out, shortcuts were scribbled in, and certain areas were marked with X's. One map had a section labeled Watch Zone. The discovery confirmed what investigators had long feared: the person responsible for the disappearances knew the park inside and out. He wasn't stumbling across his victims, he was hunting them. Near the box was a torn journal, its pages brittle with age. Most of the writing had been scratched out or destroyed by moisture, but a few lines were still legible. One entry read, "They step into the woods and think they are free, but I see them. I hear them. They never hear me." The handwriting was shaky, erratic. Whether it was a confession or a collection of thoughts from a disturbed mind, it was impossible to tell. The FBI sealed off the cave and began forensic analysis. There were no fingerprints, no usable DNA. The person who had lived there had taken care to remain anonymous. But they had left enough behind to prove intent. This was not a drifter or an animal attack. This was methodical, strategic. The cave was a base of operations for someone who had stalked these woods for years, waiting for the right moment, the right trail, the right hiker to step into their trap. Following the discovery of the hidden cave, federal investigators intensified their search across Devil's Den Park. Agents mapped the red-marked zones from the cave's maps, deploying motion-activated cameras and thermal imaging equipment throughout the northern ridges. Weeks passed with no breakthroughs, and pressure from the public began to grow. The case, now spanning several years and 6 disappearances, seemed unsolvable. Then, one of the newly placed trail cameras captured something that shattered the silence. The image was taken at dusk, along a barely used trail known as Rattler's Hollow. The camera had been triggered by the motion of a deer walking through the clearing. But behind the animal, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure. It wasn't a hiker or a ranger. The man was dressed in camouflage gear that blended perfectly with the tree line. His posture was unnerving, rigid, unmoving, his head tilted slightly, as if listening. Most disturbing of all was his face, or what covered it. A crude wooden mask, rough and splintered, shaped like a distorted human face with hollowed-out eyes. He held no flashlight, no gear, just stood silently, partially hidden by a tree, watching. The timestamp on the photo revealed it was taken just 2 days before the latest hiker. A 19-year-old college student named Marcus Lee had gone missing. Marcus had been camping with a group but ventured off on his own for a short sunrise hike and never returned. The masked figure in the photo was now the prime suspect, the first potential glimpse of the person behind the disappearances. The FBI released the photo to the public, hoping for any leads. It went viral within hours. Online sleuths, survivalist forums, and crime channels speculated wildly. Some believed the killer was a hermit or ex-soldier living off the grid. Others were convinced it was a park employee or even a ranger. Several viewers claimed the mask resembled work once sold by a local woodcarver who died in 2015. The mask-esque style was linked to folklore from the Ozark region used historically in rituals to watch the spirits of the lost. One anonymous tip led investigators to a long-abandoned cabin just outside park boundaries. The property had belonged to a man named Walter Griggs, a former forestry worker who was declared dead after a fire destroyed his home 10 years earlier. No body had ever been recovered, only fragments of bone too damaged to test. The fire had been ruled accidental. At the time, no one thought to question it. But now, everything pointed back to that name. Inside the cabin's ruins, agents found signs that someone had recently returned. A makeshift bed, a pile of old trail guides, and buried beneath a rusted metal plate, another carved mask, this one unfinished. The evidence was circumstantial, but chillingly consistent. Whoever was behind the Devil's Den disappearances wasn't a ghost. He had a name, a history, and possibly a long-term plan. And now the hunters knew they were getting close. In July 2025, just when it seemed the trail had gone cold again, a team of environmental researchers made a discovery that reignited the entire investigation. While conducting soil studies along the remote northeastern slope of Devil's Den Park, a graduate student noticed a section of unusually compacted earth beneath a dying pine tree. Curious, he began to dig and uncovered a rusted metal box, sealed tight with wire. What they found inside would provide the clearest link yet between the long-missing hikers and their presumed killer. Inside the box were 6 driver's licenses belonging to one of the missing individuals, including Emily Sands and Marcus Lee. The licenses had been carefully wrapped in plastic, protected from the elements. Beneath them was a folded map of Devil's Den, heavily marked with symbols and a single phrase scrawled on the back in shaky capital letters, "This place hides everything." The phrase sent chills through the investigative team. Forensics immediately secured the box and began testing for fingerprints, DNA, and any other trace evidence. Results came in a week later. Touch DNA recovered from the plastic wrapping matched a name long believed to be buried in the past: Walter Griggs. Griggs had once worked in the park as a forestry technician, familiar with the terrain, the trails, and the blind spots where hikers could go missing without a sound. He had been declared dead in 2015 after his cabin burned down in an isolated section near the park's edge. But now, that story was unraveling. It appeared that Griggs hadn't died in the fire at all. Instead, he had used the blaze as cover, disappearing into the forest he knew better than anyone. Investigators now believe that Griggs had been living off the grid in Devil's Den for at least a decade. With his background in forestry and survival, he could have easily remained undetected, moving between abandoned shelters, caves, and hidden caches. His motives remained unclear. But the evidence painted a terrifying picture. A man who had faked his death, watched the world move on, and chosen his victims carefully, lone hikers, off the main paths, isolated and untraceable. With this new evidence, the park was placed under temporary closure. A massive sweep began, involving local, state, and federal teams. More hidden routes were discovered, narrow passageways carved into the underbrush. Homemade blinds used for surveillance, and rusted animal traps that had been repurposed for unknown use. But despite their efforts, Griggs himself was never found. The man who had haunted Devil's Den for nearly a decade had once again vanished without a trace. Speculation ran wild. Some believed he had finally slipped up and died in the wilderness. Others were convinced he had simply moved on to new ground. But the final message he left behind, "This place hides everything," suggested otherwise. It was a warning, a promise, and a chilling reminder that the forest still holds secrets, and somewhere out there, the hiker killer may still be watching.